really wanted to go to the US Go Congress this year that's going to be happening in Seattle. Excuse me. The Go Congress that's happening in Portland. And it felt like the stars were going to align this year because my wife has a good friend who's actually from where we are in the Northeast, but she now lives out in Portland with her husband and her son. And they've been dying for us to come out. For the last however many years, they've been saying, oh, you got to come out, you got to come out. And when she comes back to the East Coast, we get to see her. And they're very nice people, but we've just never been able to because, there are other priorities. Our parents are not getting younger. We want to maximize our time with them. We have our own son. And then what time is left, we want to make sure we're maximizing that. So it just hasn't been a priority. But this year, it was really exciting to learn that, okay, great, it's in Portland and our friends there. We could kill two birds with one stone. We can get to see them. We could have a place to stay. And then I could do that too. So unfortunately, despite my hopes to have that happen, it seems like it will not come to fruition. The long story short is that my wife is going to be going out to see her friend, but I'm not going to make it happen this year to go to US Go Congress, which is a disappointment. But that's okay. There's always next time to do it. So stay positive, find some other opportunities, keep playing Go here. I need to go more to the local Go meetups. They look like they've been fairly fun. I was going last year a bit, but it just hasn't happened this year. It's tough for me to get out during the week, as I'm sure it is for many other people. So we will see. This is All Things Go. Next up, we have an interview with somebody that I serendipitously met because I was trying to actually design the cover art for this podcast. And upon connecting with him, learning about what he does, and also learning about his extensive background in the Go community, I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to interview him. So enjoy. So this is Kim Ouweleen. He's an author, a graphic designer, and a Go teacher from Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And he has made numerous Go-related artworks under his artist pseudonym Murugandi. Kim has worked for the European Go Cultural Center and the European Go Journal and has created video content for Eurogo TV and Baduk movies. He previously authored the 2016 European Go Yearbook, commissioned by the European Go Federation, and he is a 4-dan amateur player in the European Go Federation. So, Kim, thanks so much for hopping on.
Hi, Travis. Thanks for having me.
First thing is really more around your artwork. So you have a unique story that I believe you've explained on your website about how you came to get your Go handle Murugandi, which is also what you used for your artist pseudonym. How did that happen?
Yeah, so my parents, they live in the eastern part of Amsterdam, close to the Amsterdam Zoo, which is called Artis. And when I was a kid, I used to go to the zoo quite often. And there was an elephant there that was called Murugan. And somehow I picked up on that name and I liked it. And then once I started playing Go and I discovered the Kisaido Go server, I needed a username. And somehow I thought of that name of the elephant, Murugan, and I combined it with Gandhi. So we had Murugan and Gandhi. Gandhi, the famous person from history, Mahatma Gandhi, and Murugan, and it became Murugandi. And once I started playing, I later found out that Murugan is actually the name of a Hindu deity of war. So it's kind of a perfect combination of war and peace, because Mahatma Gandhi was, of course, an icon of world peace. And yeah, it's kind of the perfect symbol for the game of Go. So it's stuck, and I kept using it.
Very interesting story. I love how that all pieced together.
Yeah.
So you are an artist by trade, it seems. So I know you have I believe your master's in fine arts, and you do sell your artwork on several sites, on Etsy and a few others. And I'm just thinking about what you said on your website. You said that some of what you created, your artwork around Go, was sort of created spontaneously, and it was inspired by the names of, Go shapes and also things that refer to different animals. So the question is, how do you think Go has influenced and informed your artwork? And maybe you could also tell us a little more about how that's changed over time.
Sure. Yeah, so I've been making art. I've been making drawings since I was little. And especially during high school, I started becoming much more creative. I started writing a lot and making more art. And back in the days, my drawing style was, how would you say? Well, spontaneous, maybe. So I would just draw whatever came to mind, and you could call it kind of doodles, perhaps, but more complicated doodles in the fact that once I was drawing, I would think about, okay, this looks to be a certain shape. So in the things that I was doodling, I recognized figures and patterns, and I would elaborate on that. And then later, when I discovered Go, I started looking at my art in a different way, partly because of Go, because I started getting assignments for drawings and commissions. And I really started, for example, the Go shapes. I got really inspired by the names for certain shapes. So you have the tortoise shell, which is also the title of one of my drawings, which shows the shape that has that name, and it refers to a turtle. So you have the tortoise shell on the shell of a tortoise. Yeah, so it really changed the way I draw, actually. It's much more figurative now, let's say, and with a certain idea in mind before I start drawing.
It's interesting too, because Go is obviously a purely visual game. You're certainly doing things in your head a lot of times when you're trying to read moves ahead, which at your level you're doing quite a bit of. But I see what you mean around going from all the patterns, right, that you probably stockpiled in your mind from years and years of playing and tournaments and all those things. I could certainly see how that would start to influence and sort of subconsciously change and affect your artwork. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, sure. And there's a lot of interesting parts about Go culture. You have the names of Go shapes. You also have just interesting stories about Go players, and there's actually a lot of inspiration that you can take from that in art. I've created many drawings that refer to Go. For example, there's another shape of two Tetsuji moves on the first line. That's called Tanuki no Hara Tsuzumi in Japanese, which translates in English to the raccoon dog drums its belly. And this actually refers to Japanese folklore. There's a whole background about this, about Japanese mythology, people walking and being lured into the woods when they hear certain drumming noises. And then this is depicted in Japanese art as raccoon dogs drumming their bellies and also drumming, of course, other instruments and such things to lure people away from their destiny. And this is also the name of that particular Go shape. And I think it's because of the visual aspect of the shape. You have two stones that are positioned right next to each other on the first line. And together they capture the opponent's stones by creating a lack of liberties, which is only possible in that very specific position.
Very interesting. Is your sense, Kim, that these stories are created or come about, or the names that come with them, is your sense that this is somewhat of a mnemonic device? So to say, okay, if there's this very specific pattern and I have this really interesting story and background around it that then is distilled into a name, that is your sense that actually provided a way to remember the overall situation, or is your sense otherwise?
I say so. It's probably part of it. Of course, this particular name about the raccoon dog is a Japanese term. So actually, it's interesting because some of the terms they have overlap in Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. For example, the tortoise shell, which is what I talked about previously. It's a shape that's kind of a large ponuki of sorts. And this actually, in all those languages, translates to the same thing. So it's called the tortoise shell in all of those languages. But the raccoon dog that drums its belly is very specific to Japanese. The Chinese and Korean names for this shape are different. So it's actually interesting. It depends on the cultures, I suppose, but it's definitely a mnemonic device, and it's also, yeah, it's a testament to folklore and to culture, I suppose.
Which is a huge part of what makes this game so incredibly nuanced and interesting, right, and fascinating to so many of us. So
Right.
I really appreciate that background. Maybe we shift gears a second to some of what you've talked about, how you started in playing Go. And
Mm-hmm.
so you did an interview back in 2017 for the European Go Federation that had you describe how you first learned about and how you started playing Go when you were around 16 years old, I believe.
Right.
And you mentioned how your quote, your curiosity was triggered and that you initially lost most of your first games, but you sort of persevered, you hung in there, and you just said, I just hate losing. I want to get to a point where I can start, winning, hopefully. What
Right.
can you remember about how those games initially hooked you, to keep you going? In other words, like what aspects of that kept you coming back over and over again?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I remember playing my first game of Go with my dad, and we both didn't really know what we were doing. We found, this old manual in a box with plastic stones, and we were trying to play the game, but it was very vague and very abstract. And together we determined that I was the victor, but it, yeah, it kind of triggered something in me. We both didn't really understand the game, so I wanted to find out more. Then I started playing online. I found the Kiseto Go server, and I think what mostly interested me, or let's say triggered me, was the disappearing of stones. So I played a lot of games, and every time my stones would disappear, and I just didn't understand what was going on. I knew that you had to capture and had to surround each other, but somehow, yeah, I was always one step behind. And yeah, then I thought I was going to capture my opponent, and suddenly all my own stones would disappear. And I just couldn't stand it. I didn't understand what was happening. And I think that was the initial trigger, let's say.
And Kim, it sounds like that was particularly happening on the online server, Kasedo.
Yes.
So that's something where it's obviously set up so that if you follow those rules, it will automatically capture your stones versus when you're playing with your dad in person. You might miss that and say, oh gosh, I didn't take these stones off. I didn't capture them. I was supposed to.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah. I don't think that was happening when we were playing against each other, because we clearly did not understand the concept of liberties properly yet.
Which is really interesting, because I would think you would agree, particularly at the time that you started playing Go, right, was really during an era where perhaps the online servers were maybe less popular, certainly than they are now, if that's a statement that you would agree with.
I wouldn't say so, actually. When I started playing on the Kiseto Go server, there were a lot of players. Now Kiseto has kind of become I don't want to say it, but it's sort of dead. You had the OGS server, which is much more popular. But actually, it was a very big scene at that time.
Interesting. Did not know that. So that's good to know. And so when you think about those things that you were able to start to say, oh, like, why is this group being captured? Why are these stones being captured? It goes back to this question that I'm sure you get all the time as a Go teacher, which is when you have somebody approach you that they see you playing a game in person, or they learned about you through someone or a friend or something like this, and they ask you about it, and you're going to introduce them to the game. What are some of the things that you say, maybe some do's and don'ts so that, you don't want to get too, how do I say, intense, all those things?
Yeah, that's, I think that's very personal. So it's all about understanding the friend or the acquaintance or the person that's interested in the game that's in front of you. Because some people, they really like to be taught all the rules and all the very specific details of the rules before they start playing. But then there's also people that prefer to just find out by doing it. And personally, I think the combination of those two things is very important. So the rules are essential, of course, to the game, and you want to explain them, but you want to be very succinct. You want to have the person find out sort of by doing it how the rules actually apply. So one of the don'ts, and this is something that I see very often, is that Go teachers are very excited to teach the game. They really want the other person to understand and to also share in that excitement and that enthusiasm. And because of that, they lose sight of the fact that they might be oversharing. They are bombarding the other person with information, and at some point it becomes too much. So what I try to do myself is I share a couple of rules about liberties and about eyes, and maybe I will mention ko, but I try to be as succinct as possible. So 5 minutes, that's it. And okay, let's play a game. And if you have any questions, just ask.
I love it. That's a very thought out answer, which tells me that you've had a lot of experiences over the years seeing people or people you don't know maybe approach the game, and then you're trying to think about it. Okay, how do I share this without, again, coming on too strong?
Yes.
When you think about a lot of the games that you played, I see in that interview that you played a lot of blitz games, which I think we can simply define as shorter time control games. What would you define as blitz time controls roughly?
Well, it depends, but I would say maybe 30 seconds per person is a blitz format. You can also lower it to 15 seconds, 10 seconds. I used to play 10 seconds per person absolute on the internet. So you have only 10 seconds to make your move. And if you don't, you just lose.
So what do you see there, Kim, as obviously there are merits to playing more quickly. There are merits to playing longer games. How do you see those trade-offs? What about that made you want to play the blitz games?
Yeah, so when I was starting playing Go, I wanted to get as much information as possible. So for me, Blitz was a way to just play as many games as I could and to get more input. So the merits of Blitz, in my opinion, are that to a certain level, you can find out a lot of new information, particularly about Joseki patterns. So when I was starting out, in the beginning, of course, I didn't understand liberties, and this was all very basic. But then once I started understanding, there's these openings that you can play, and people tend to play this way. They play on the 3-4 points and on the 4-4 points, and this is the Chinese opening, and so on. It really helped me to play a lot of games to understand all the variants in those openings. So up to a certain level, I think it just helps to see a lot of different moves and to understand the do's and don'ts of the variations. But then once you reach a certain level, it becomes very difficult to improve by only playing blitz.
And is your sense, Kim, that there are certain phases, perhaps, of being a certain level of player at a certain point where you as a teacher say, okay, it's actually helpful for you to just get a lot of repetition in via these shorter blitz games, see a lot of different patterns, or are there certain points where you say, okay, that's not really helpful anymore? Is there any way to articulate that, or is it really just case by case?
I think it's case by case. It's quite personal. For me, blitz worked very well. But most of my students, when I talk to them about this particular topic, they don't really enjoy blitz because it can be very harsh. If you go through your time and you are ahead, it might just be too frustrating. You get demotivated by it. For me, it was a motivation, let's put it that way, to be sharp all the time and to be under pressure. But most Of my students prefer to play longer games, so games with longer time settings, and to really think through each move very carefully, which is also valuable in its own sense because that way it's easier to follow the logic when you review the game with your teacher. So what I usually do with my students is I play a game against them and then we discuss the game together afterwards. And if you do this in a blitz format, it becomes very messy. I might still remember all the logic of my own moves, but the student might not. So I'm not sure if that way is actually helpful to the student.
But I can see, Kim, that you would go through with each student, depending on what their situation is, you might start to find, okay, this person is really getting too hung up on overthinking every single move in a longer time control setting. Maybe he or she or they should mix it up and do a short one just to, so I can see how coming at it from both sides could be beneficial. Is that something that you would agree with?
Yeah, definitely. It all depends on the student. Some people are very good at the openings and they need to also focus on Tsumego, for example. So it's really case by case. But I would definitely say that playing more blitz games, if you're too hung up on specific things that you play all the time, can widen your horizons because you can experiment. You know, if you play a long game, you tend to really you get really attached to your moves, right? Because you're putting so much time and thought into it that if you make an unusual move or a move you might think is a mistake, but you're not sure, and it backfires, you might get frustrated from it. But by playing blitz, you can just experiment. You can try whatever you want. And maybe the move you thought that was actually not good turns out to be a really interesting move that you'd like to play more often. So it's also a way to experiment and to be more free in your playing.
Very interesting. And I'm sure you could tell us a whole lot more about this concept of hangma. So in blitz games, you are likely able to see how these stones are going down in a quicker format, and you might be able to visualize things a little bit more. But I imagine you could probably devote multiple hours or sessions discussing some of these things. So if you don't mind, I'm going to just shift gears a little bit again. So let's go back to 2010 when you spent 3 months in China and you studied under a 7-dan professional. And you said in your 2017 interview that you sort of found yourself in China as a student not long after first learning about the opportunity. How did you make the decision and how did it tie in with where you were at that particular stage of life in terms of career, jobs, all those sorts of things?
Right. Yeah, that actually worked out perfectly because I just finished my university studies at the time, studied art history, and I had finished my master's degree. And this program in China, it all went through Guo, who is a Chinese 5-dan professional that lives in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. She's been living there for many years, and she's a multiple European champion, multiple Dutch champion. And I found out that there is a program of a friend of hers in Wuhan, China, a professional named Yan An. And some of my girlfriends from the Netherlands had previously been to this program, had participated in it. And they told me a lot of good things about it. So I went on to do a little interview, you could say, or a little catch up with Guo to see how interested I really was and if it would suit me to go there. Everybody that goes there has to first talk to her to see if it suits them. And then I ended up there somehow. So it was sort of a spontaneous thing. I knew that I always wanted to study Go in a more formal way through a teacher because I had never really had a teacher up to that point. I had just basically taught myself the game by playing a lot. And then I was there. I was in Wuhan with 2 other Dutch guys. I was there for 3 months. One of the other Dutch Go players was there with me the whole stay. And one other dude left after a month. So he was there for a shorter time period. And there was one other German guy and a Frenchman. And every day we would be playing in the apartment. So Yanan would come over and play simultaneous games against us and review the games. This would be during the week. And then in the weekends, we would go to his Go schools. He had 2 different Go schools with kids from about 5 years old to 10 years old. And there were different classes, and we were in the higher Dan classes, which would be from, I think, maybe 2 Dan level to 6 Dan. And yeah, it was really interesting, actually. I learned a lot from that experience, not only about the game itself, the moves and the essence of playing, but also about the Go culture and about the sport of Go. Because there were some of the kids there that were extremely talented, and they were maybe 8 years old, 10 years old, and they were already 6 Dan. And there were actually 2 of them that later became professional. One is called Xier Hao. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that guy.
For the audience, Xier Hao is one of the top professionals in the world now. He's winning championship titles. Is that correct?
Yes, it's correct. He's a 9-Dan professional.
That's incredible.
Then, he was just a boy, He was, I think, 8 years old or so, and he was already 7 Dan. And it's just a sweet kid. He was extremely fanatic about Go, but very calm. It was like playing against an adult, but it's an 8-year-old kid that's sitting in front of you. It's really remarkable. And there was one other a kid called Zhang Peipei, a girl. She was a little bit older, but she was also already 6 Dan. And later she also became a female professional.
I see. I'm less familiar with her, but I'm sure to folks that have been in the Go world like you have for quite a few years, I'm sure they may know of her. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting with Xier how we could get into this more, but learning more about how more seasoned Go players like yourself describe his way of playing as going into large areas and moyos that the opponent is trying to take, and really being able to live under almost any situation.
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
Yeah, that's incredible. I wish I had that ability. If you think back to those times in China where you're in these Go schools and playing with these 6 Dan 8-year-olds, which is, for the uninitiated, that's an incredibly high ranking, similar to Kim's ranking. Were there any funny, just, I don't know, moments that stuck out to you during that time?
Oh yeah, lots. It was really chaotic in those Go schools. The kids would be running around, throwing Go stones, making jokes while playing. I remember that one of the kids didn't like the fact that I was taking slightly too long for my move, and he was pointing at his wrist like, it's time, make your next move. Stuff like that. They were just crazy.
That's very funny. I'm sure you have a whole lot of stories to tell there, but if you had to do all of this over again, so let's say it's now 2024 and you're at the same phase of life that you were before. You're just after your art history degree and you're saying, I want to do this more in depth. Do you think that in this day and age, with where the tools and online presence and all those things have come for Go, do you think you might have done it a similar way, or would you have done it differently?
That's a good question. It was very valuable for me. So in retrospect, I don't know if I would change anything, but of course we're living in a different day and age now. You can play on your computer, and your computer is stronger than most of the professional Go players. So to actually go all the way to China just to train the game, it's quite a commitment. I think people that are starting off playing Go now are very lucky in that regard. They can learn so much just by playing and going through their games with their computers. So it's kind of, it's a difficult question to answer, because on the one hand, it's fantastic that you can train by yourself. And on the other hand, some of the mysticism of Go and some of the, it has kind of disappeared, Because when I went to China, you had to do that in order to become stronger. There was no really any other way. And now it has completely changed.
That's really interesting you say that, Kim, because as I've come into learning about this game fairly recently, right, about around 2020 is when I started, you get this sense that okay, there's probably an ebb and flow of interest or popularity in Go. It certainly sounds like it's more ubiquitous and well known in the East, where it's not as much in the West. But
Mhm.
it sounds like even still, it's perhaps gotten more popular to some degree, or just the technologies have been able to catch up and improve.
Mhm.
What's your sense around popularity, right? Okay, if it is getting popular to whatever degree, if it's at a slow pace or a fast pace, do you feel like there's a sadness or a risk of losing that what you describe as mysticism
Mhm.
component to it?
Mm, perhaps, but I'm not sure if it's a bad thing. So the game has definitely changed since 2016 when AlphaGo came on the scene and defeated first Van Hui, the European champion, also Chinese professional Go player, and then later Isedol, the one of the top Korean players at the time, one of the best players in the world at that time. And after that all happened, there was a huge increase in popularity. So I used to work, for example, in a board game store, where we sold chess, for example, but also Go material. And after the match with Lee Sedol and AlphaGo, we sold so much more Go equipment. We got so many inquiries about the game, and you could see it, in the Go clubs, in the tournaments. A lot of new players came in. So definitely the popularity has increased a bit. I think after a little while, it kind of evened out again. So there was this huge boost, and then you cannot expect it to keep rising. So it kind of leveled out. But yeah, I'm not sure if in the East the popularity is still increasing. I think it's a steady thing, but in the West the increase was pretty big. Yeah.
Well, that wraps up the first half of my interview with Kim Ouweleen, aka Murugandi. Stay tuned for the next episode where we'll continue with the second half of the interview. Now we're going to look at the online forums. So let's start by jumping into a social media scan on the online Go server forum. Ben Kyo had a great post. Ben Kyo is Ben Mantle. He's an 8 Dan on Fox and a 5 Dan in Canada. But he had a post about asking the creators of OGS if they could turn off AI as sort of the default setting when you play a game. If you decide to support the website and get that AI ability, it seems to turn on automatically as soon as you finish a game. And Ben was commenting on how for his newer players, it was a little bit confusing because they would see all the different markings and notations from the AI system on the board and be confused. I think it goes to a more interesting question that I think a lot of us ask, which is, when is it good and bad to use the AI tool? I certainly support the website and have the AI capability. And there are some pros and cons to both sides. The pros are more obvious, such as using the AI to understand key mistakes. If you see big swings in the win rate or in the change in points at a certain part of the game, that's going to tell you, okay, there's something going on at that part of the game. I need to look at it more carefully and understand what might have happened. AI also might give you some of those immediate initial best choices on the board, and sometimes it might be obvious. You might say, oh, okay, that's where I needed to play because that was the weakest area on the board, or something of that nature. The other reason AI might be really good is if for some reason you just do not have human access to better players that could review your own game, because that is likely the best way. The issue is that creating that default where the AI turns on as soon as your game is over is that it really creates a poor reviewing habit, a poor setup to then immediately have this Pavlovian response to look at the AI and see what it says. And from what I've learned from some of my instructors and teachers on Go, it's very clear that the best way to do it is to actually not use that AI initially. Go through your game 1, 2, maybe even 3 times and go through that game yourself and remember what you were thinking at different moves, why you made those moves, why those moves then appeared to not work, and try to come up with your own sequences and variations to see what would have worked better, because it then forces you to think through those things and not have the crutch of the AI tool. The review feature is great even just for yourself, right? To review the game yourself, let alone having somebody else review it. I will use that review tool, put in my comments and thoughts on different sections of my game, and then I can use that to review it with either, my Go teacher or somebody else. And those notes are very helpful after you do that review yourself a few times and remind yourself, okay, this is me trying to do my best at what I think was going on or why things didn't go well or why they did go well. Then ideally you actually go to a human to review it, probably somebody that's at least 5 ranks or more above you. And then they can give you their thoughts on where things went right and wrong. Because after that point, maybe the AI is good. If the person reviewing it with you is also unsure of a spot, then we might toggle AI together. But the fact of the matter is 99% of us just don't and can't play like AI. And so it's more important to understand all those different Go principles and rules and understand what a more seasoned and higher ranking player is seeing on the board at given moments of the game. But it brought up a really interesting connection to a great post on Reddit that Sadaharu2624 provided. I'm trying to remember when. It was not long ago, but it was a lecture by either a PhD student or a actual professor. His name was Dr. Quentin Rendu, and this was at the first International Conference on Go Studies in Seoul, Korea, back in late August of 2023. It looked at the AI win rate that's used in systems for us playing Go. And win rate is simply defined as if the AI played itself 1,000 times from a certain board state, it would win, X percent of the time. And so it did a couple different things in this presentation. First, he looked at the end of the opening. So let's say move 50 in a game, and it looked at what AI had calculated as the win rate if it were playing from that moment. And then it compared that to what a 1 Dan player actual win rate would be on Fox, a 7 Dan on Fox, and then professional ranked players. And when comparing actual win rates to the AI win rates at move 50 after the opening is pretty much finished, there was a very, very big difference in win rate. So just to give you an example, if there was a score difference of 5 points, a 1 Dan on Fox might have a win rate of somewhere between 50 to 60%. Okay, so pretty much a coin toss, whereas the AI is giving itself a win rate of 85%. And this difference seems to hold as the score difference gets bigger and bigger. If you go under a score difference of less than 5 points, then sure, there's convergence. If you then look at the same thing, you look at win rate later in the game. So at move 200, which is arguably end game, on a 5-point score difference, there's still a pretty significant difference between a 1 Dan ranking on Fox, who might have a 70 to 75% win rate, and AI, which will have more of a 95% win rate. The interesting point, though, at this part of the game is that the professional ranks, so 1 Dan professional to 9 Dan, the win rates actually at this point in the game was very similar to what the win rate of the AI was. So the moral of the story here is that you should not trust the AI win rate. It appears that the score differential feels more helpful to me, but at the same token, that's also what AI thinks it would be scoring if it were playing. And I think there's still the same flaws there, but point difference at least feels more possible that I could actually try to understand if I could get those points at that moment in the game. And if you go to the estimating tool and you have a more seasoned player review it, they can look at that estimation with you and understand, that looks a little bit suspect, right? AI is saying it could get this area or it doesn't have this area, but that may not be the case for you. Now we're going to talk with Gazza White, who is a co-host on the Pro Go Baduk Weiqi podcast on YouTube. He's going to give us a little bit of a background into how he got into the professional Go scene and learning about it. And then he's also going to give us a little bit of an understanding of how the professional Go scene is currently set up. First of all, Gazza, can you just tell me a little bit about yourself in terms of Go, really anything you want to say?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll start off with how I got into Go. It was actually 20 years ago when I was at university, and I met a guy by the name of Xiao Dai, and he introduced me to the game, actually.
Oh, wow.
I was studying mathematics at university, and I played chess. I was terrible at chess. The game Go just seemed to be, I don't know, I found it more interesting.
Okay.
It seemed more my style. I was actually also terrible at that game anyway, but I really enjoyed it. The important thing. I played it for a few years, and it was actually really hard to find communities to play. Go on the internet wasn't really super accessible, at least in English speaking back then. So it wasn't so easy to find other people that played. And eventually the stress of my studies sort of took over, and I kind of stopped playing for quite a while. Then, eventually I finished, my thesis. I got back in touch with Xiao Dai, who by then had moved on and gotten a job and stuff like that. And I said, look, I've got nothing to do. You want to hang out? And he's like, oh, come see me at the Go Club. There's a local one. And this was news to me. There was a local Go Club where I lived in Sydney. I didn't know this.
Okay.
So I went down there, saw Xiao Dai, and it was this little Go Club with like a dozen people. One of them was a professional. And back then I knew the concept of professional, but I also knew that there weren't any Australian professionals.
Okay.
So I'm like, how does this work?
Right.
It turns out it was a bloke by the name of Ahn Young-gil. He's a professional from Korea, and he was actually there as a representative of the Korean Baduk Association to try and spread Go in Australia.
Huh.
He was kind of running the club, and I just found that fascinating. So I went to the club. My first time at the club, he gave a lesson on a professional game, going over some of the moves. I didn't understand any of it, but it was just still fascinating. And it turned out that the very next day was going to be the national championships, the Australian national championships. And Xiao Dai, he tells me, oh, you should enter, and anyone can enter. So I entered. I lost all my games, and I've been hooked ever since.
That's a great story. So what was it about the person, this professional Korean Go player, did that? One, it sparked your interest in Go, and that's where you started with Go. But did that then lead into more of an interest in following professional Go? Because I know some other players or my Go teacher and things like this, and they know a little bit about professional Go, but not quite to the level that you seem to.
100%. Young Gil was a huge catalyst, not just in restarting my interest in the game as a player, but as a fan of the professional scene. Every Friday they had this Go Club, and most of the time he would give a lesson, and it would either be on Joseki in the opening, or most of the time it would be a review of a professional game. And the big name at the time, this was maybe 10 years ago, and the big name at the time was a guy by the name of Lee Sedol. So many of the games were about Lee Sedol, and I remember there were some other players like Gu Li and Kong Jie and stuff like that. And he would say, so this is a game between Lee Sedol and Gu Li. This is in the Samsung Cup. And I was thinking to myself, oh, Samsung, I've heard of them. But the whole concept of the Samsung Cup and what that meant, I wasn't really too sure. So I was interested in these games, but at the time I was really unfamiliar with what all of these tournaments meant, like what their relevance was. Like you would mention tournaments like the LG Cup and the Meijin. I remember I sort of got an inkling that the Japanese players seemed to play against Japanese players most of the time. They just seemed to play within themselves, and they had their own special tournaments. And then the Koreans and Chinese would be between, a Korean player and a Chinese player or something like that. So that was the concept that I got. But I also felt, there's so many tournaments. It's hard to get a grasp. And I kind of just enjoyed the lessons and the games and stuff like that at the time. It wasn't really until I think the pandemic hit that I really started to do a bit more research into the professional scene as a whole and tried to answer all those questions that I initially had. Because obviously back then, going outside was more difficult. And so I was inside a lot, watching YouTube a lot. And I stumbled across a channel called Baduk TV. It's a Korean channel that live streams professional games. And this is something that I'd only seen once before. The only time I'd seen streams of professional games was when Lee Sedol played AlphaGo about 8 years ago now. But then in 2020, I stumbled across a channel and I found out that the Korean Baduk Association would stream professional games every day, like all the time. And I was like, oh, wow, I could watch professional games, like the actual players playing in real time.
Right.
Which was just insane. And that sort of accessibility is what sort of piqued my curiosity in the professional scene, because I'm like, well, what are they playing for? Like, what's the tournament that they're playing in? And then the game ends. I'm like, okay, so this player won, this player lost. What does that mean? Does the losing player get eliminated? Does the winning player qualify for something else? I'm not too sure. So I tried to do some more research there. And then that's when I discovered the whole concept of how the different organizations, the different national organizations run their professional scene, what the tournaments are like, the typical tournament structure, the general grasp of that.
Were you able to understand what was happening in the professional games, or was it really, wow, this is really interesting, I want to just learn more about it because it's just such a fascinating new thing?
Yeah, I only speak English. I'm trying to learn Korean at the moment. It's a slow process, but certainly I only speak English. And these streams were in Korean.
Right.
The other thing is that around this time was also when, obviously in 2016 was when AI proved that it can compete against the best human players in the world. But in 2020, that was when not only was AI becoming an integrated tool for professional learning, but also for the streams, started to get integrated into the streams,
right,
and was also accessible to just everyday, laptop users, which I think made things, for someone like me who's not particularly strong at Go and only speaks English, that sort of ability to use the AI while following the games helped a significant amount in me appreciating the games and understanding them. Because while I didn't understand what the commentators were saying, even just the AI evaluation could be used as a guide to sort of follow the flows of the game.
That makes a lot of sense, because even if you don't understand why the probability moved to, black 50% or whatever it might be, your interest is piqued. So you're saying, gosh, what just happened? What subtle change happened from that one stone being placed?
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, that's right. I remember then, so I kept doing more research, and I found that the Nihon Kihin, the main Japanese organization, they also had a YouTube channel where they would sometimes stream the big title matches in Japan. So I would follow that as well. I don't remember how, but I ended up stumbling upon the Korean Baduk Association website, which is an extremely thorough website in terms of getting information and results and just news. It is all in Korean, but Google Translate helps
wonders
a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, but having access to that sort of information as well has really helped me understand better and get more information and knowledge on the professional scene.
Well, I have to say personally, being someone who got to live in China for a year and I didn't understand or read Chinese, I learned some basic Chinese to get around. I'm very impressed with your drive to just keep understanding these things, even with Google Translate, which it translates a lot, but it also doesn't always do a perfect job, as we know. So I really admire your ability to just dive into it and make sense of it and meaning out of it. So maybe if you don't mind, we can start to dive in. How would you describe to a newcomer the current professional Go scene?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, one way to describe it is there are different regions in the world, and each region will have their own separate professional system. And typically in the major regions like Japan and Korea and China, typically what I've heard is that you start off as like an apprentice or an insei, where you're basically training to become a professional. And then there is a professional qualification tournament where it's like a whole bunch of people who want to be professional compete against each other, and the best performers become certified. They get a professional certification. So then each region will have a group of professionals, and they'll all be run by an organization who will arrange domestic tournaments for these professionals to compete in.
Mhm.
The best professionals of each region will often compete against each other in international competition.
Okay.
There are 6 regions that have separate professional systems. So there is, well, technically there's actually 7, because Japan has 2 different organizations, the Nihon Kiin and the Kansai
Oh, okay.
Kiin.
Kansai.
It's
Okay.
from the Kansai region of Japan. So historically, travel wasn't as easy as now. So the Kansai region had their own professional organization, and that organization has remained. Most of the Nihon Kiin tournaments involve Kansai Kiin players as well, but the organizations are still separate, and there are still Kansai, for instance, Kansai Kiin exclusive events. It is interesting because the Nihon Kiin does have a Kansai branch, which is separate from the Kansai Kiin. It's a little bit confusing.
How interesting.
But
Did not know that.
historical thing. China has the Chinese Weiqi Association. Korea has the Korean Baduk Association. Taiwan have their own association. I forget the name of that one. And then most recently, Europe and North America have their own professional systems, both of which started about 10 years ago. So in the past, Europeans and North Americans who aspired to become professional and like dedicated themselves to being professional would go to a different region in one of those Asian regions to get a professional certification there. So, for instance, Michael Redmond, who is an American, he is a professional within the Nihon Kiin. Yeah, at the time there was no American system for turning professional, but you could go to another region